screen here again as usual. That way you all can just kind of see what I'm seeing. So kind of first things to kind of, I posted that format of the test, but I think it's good to see if you have questions on any of that format, maybe as you've read through it. So the first ones are multiple choice questions, and it's just choosing the appropriate test. Now what I mean by that is it's just going to give you like a little, like intro essay type question. There's not necessarily going to be any like numbers or a ton of numbers in it. So for example, might just say, I'm interested in figuring out what % of students took both 7-week courses. And that might be all it says. And since it would be like a yes/no question, did you take both 7-week courses? Yes or no. We're working with a categorical variable, just one of them. So in a sense, you just be doing like a proportion confidence interval technically for that one. So I kind of gave you all the different choices that you're going to see show up. So the one sample proportion, that was like the first hypothesis testing and confidence interval stuff we did. So that would have been modules 2B and 3, would have been like where that stuff came from. The one sample mean was more recent stuff. I believe that one was module 5, if I remember correctly. Chi-square test, that's your relationship between two categorical variables. So that was 4A. The two sample T and then the pair T were both from that module 6A that we did last week. Anova was 6B, and regression is one that we're currently doing, that module 7. And so as a kind of a sidebar, we'll come back to this, because I had one gal send me an email today, and I think she missed that I have this little review thing going on right here in the middle. So if you click on that review, it's going to take you to some review videos. It might not cover everything that you might want to see, but it's kind of a good place to start for some review. And so this one is like one that I put together that was a longer one. This one's like a 40-minute video. Then there's kind of some ones that are very specific, targeted down here. Some different questions on that one. But the one thing I'm going to point out is if you watch, oops, wrong one, the very first video that's really, really long, if you get to like this 30-minute and 30-second-ish mark video, it's going to go over the formula sheet and tells you when do I use which formula. Because that's one of the biggest things that students, I think, struggle with the final exam is now that everything on that formula sheet's fair game, it's a little overwhelming of kind of like, okay, I know I'm doing a hypothesis test, but which one of like the 6 hypothesis tests that I learned am I doing in this example? And even though it's going to sound really, really silly, it really just comes down to how many variables you have and what type they are. So let's talk through that. No. I mean, unfortunately, it's kind of like more to study. So it's mainly this stuff down here that students struggle with. And so when you're in a proportion for one sample, you're basically working with one categorical variable. That's all you have, just one categorical variable. If you're a mean for one sample, instead you have one quantitative variable. So it's kind of like that front sheet, basically we're working with just a variable. It's either going to be categorical or quantitative. Once you get to the back, this is when we have 2 variables showing up. So there's kind of 3 different combinations that could happen. You could have 2 categorical variables that are both categorical, which this one says 2 categorical variables on it, right there for you. You could have both variables be quantitative variables, which is this last one that you see labeled there for you as well. That's our regression that we've just been working on here in Module 7. Or you could have one of each. So basically you could have one categorical variable and one quantitative. That's going to be what everything else is. So ANOVA, the 2 independent samples and the 2 dependent samples all fall into that same category, that you have one categorical variable and one quantitative. But really how you kind of think about it when you're doing it is that you have this quantitative variable that you're comparing among groups. And it's that grouping that creates that categorical variable that I'm mentioning there. If you only have 2 categories, it's either going to be the 2 independent or 2 dependent. If you have 3 or more categories, it's going to be ANOVA. So I know I really simplified that really quickly, but it comes down to just how many variables, 1 or 2, one variable, we're on the front part, two variables, you're on the back part, and then it's just what type of variable they are that's going to kind of narrow down where you are. Is that helpful? I mean, and watching that part of the review video is probably also going to be helpful because you can always pause it, explain it, make the notes to yourself and everything there as well. But that's kind of what this part of that video is also talking through, is just how do I know which formula to use? It's been a while. And so that's where, it's like you trying to get back at some of that stuff can be a little rough at first. Going back to that format then of the test. So I kind of went through that part to really help you understand these first choosing the appropriate test, mainly because output's not going to be given to you for those. So like you don't have that kind of stuff to go off of to help you. It simply comes down to what variables do you have and what type they are going to help you with this first part. It's also going to help you with later questions, but it's definitely going to help you with this first part. Nope, just a quick multiple choice answer and move on. Yeah, so you're not actually going to have to do the test, it's just choose. Yep. Yeah, so just which one would they? You should be able to go back and change anything you want. Mainly because I know like you start doing one thing and it triggers something else. So I like you to be able to float around. Well, on that note, let me go back to an old test so I can show you guys this. I can't show you the current one, of course. But if you look at like a quiz, if you haven't ever used that bookmark feature, like, right, you can actually kind of like click next to a question. That way you kind of know which ones that you want to come back to. This might be even more important to you when it comes to the final because it might feel like there's a ton of questions and you might forget which ones you need to come back to. So you can always click and then unclick it like once you've done it. So if you need to, feel free to use this bookmarking option just to help you know which questions you want to go back. Like for example, you might, choose an answer on that multiple choice question, but you might want to go back and look at it later if you have time. So you can just, okay, I'm going to mark this so I come back and look at it. At least if you ran out of time, you already answered it, but you always kind of like reference to yourself that you want to go back and look at something that way there too. Just I know that with the final being a little bit longer, it's a little bit harder to lose like which questions did I want to go back and look at. Then there is kind of one overall matching question that has 5 parts to it. The most helpful tip I can tell you that's from module 7. I don't know if that will be horribly helpful for you, but it's a module 7 question. And then there's some more multiple choice questions. The first one are just more kind of general questions. So going back and looking at your old test to kind of see some old multiple choice questions could be helpful of kind of triggering some of those types of things. Then there's going to be 3 questions that are just choosing between those independent and dependent samples. Like where it's going to fall into that. There's 2 groups that I'm comparing. I've just got to figure out if it's independent or dependent. And so by watching those videos, if you saw me draw all those silly pictures, I know that feels silly, but that's sometimes one of the best ways of kind of figuring out. I mean, it can be helpful because if you really think about it like one item at a time, I think it's a lot more helpful than if you try to think about it all at once. Doing that one at a time can be very helpful, I think, for people there. Then as it says here, there's basically 7 bigger questions. 3 of them, like it says there, are guaranteed to be from the new stuff. So there's going to be one from 6A. So there's going to be the choose independent, dependent, and actually do the problem kind of question. There's going to be one from 6B, which is analysis of variance, that Anova that we just learned. And the one from the current stuff we're doing, that regression. All 3 of those, you'll be able to tell exactly what they are because there's going to be StatCrunch output for them. Like, so, I mean, I can't hide what they are. Like, you're going to see the one that has this is going to say Anova on it. This one's going to say simple linear regression. Like, it's not going to be, like, you have to guess what they are. Those are going to be very, very obvious of which problems those are for you. Yeah, and so then there's 4 problems that are more going back to older stuff. So that could be like, module 1A, normals question. It could be like, here's a histogram and describe it in Chebyshev's rule. It could be a proportion, so that's where I think the review aspect is really needed for you. Just feeling a little bit more comfortable with that, especially if you think back to modules 1, 2, and 3. I point those out mostly because that's where before StatCrunch really came into the picture, and we pretty much did everything by hand. Since now we've been doing more stuff with StatCrunch, sometimes remembering how to do it before StatCrunch came in can be a little confusing to students because it's been a while since you've actually had to do some of that stuff by hand. So especially going back to module 2B, the first time we did hypothesis testing, and module 3, the first time we did confidence intervals, can be very, very helpful for your review. So that's what the format looks like. Did you have other questions looking at the format there? Of anything you're sure of? Like 1 or 2 points, I can't even remember. I'll go ahead and tell you one of them. It's to give a future student a tip. So I mean, they're not necessarily, they're more like, I'm learning from what you guys are kind of learning as well. So just kind of like, tell me something about like maybe what you use, and so you're not needing to study for the extra credit. You're either gonna, like, if there's like, I think there's one that's stat related and one that's not, you're either gonna know the stat one or not. It's not worth studying for. So don't fret about that part. Other questions format wise? Wait, nope. Well, if I remember correctly, I believe you have 3 hours to take the test. Which I think out of all the tests, the final is one that we are less time crunched for, is because you do have that longer period of time. So I don't usually find students running out of time for the final. Like that hasn't seemed to ever really be an issue. Because it's either like you know it or you don't. I think kind of by the time you get to the final that it's not something where you really feel rushed for time at that point. Make sure like you have all the tables and formula sheets in front of you. So again, full formula sheet this time. The Z table, I know it's been a little while since we've used it, but make sure you have that. Your T table, just in case you need them. It's always great to make sure you have all 3 of those things in front of you. And then of course, if you haven't already, right, there's the final exam practice that's out there with the solution along with it. And so depending upon what kind of person you are when it comes to studying this, I don't want to show the solution. So it's long. So, I mean, I'm trying to kind of give you a little bit of everything. This doesn't mean that this covers every possible type of question, but there's ones on here that will have StatCrunch output just like you would see on the test. That way you kind of use that. But what some students like to do is they just like to read the beginning part of the problem and figure out what formula am I using. Like, right, can I just figure out, without even doing the problem yet, where am I on the formula sheet for part A? Where am I on the formula sheet for part B? And so some students will work that and then compare that already to the solution to see if like they're using the right formula, and then actually go back and work the problems. So for some students, it's just reading through it first to figure out what you need. So let's see, where's ones with some StatCrunch output? Like, look, see, Anova. You kind of got to know what you're going to be doing with that one as soon as you see some of that as the output. See some more with ones with output here. Here's another one with output. Been a little while since you've probably seen that one. And then there's even one of the most recent stuff on here as well, so that you have some more practice with that. So this is definitely on the long side, but I wanted to make sure you had quite a bit of things to practice as you were working through it. And then of course, I never give you a practice without a solution. So you have the key there to go with it to be able to compare to it as well. All right, what types of questions you guys got? There'll be some that are like fill in the blank, and there'll be some where like you actually have to show your work all the way. Yeah. I cannot remember off the top of my head, but I want to say like around 3 or 4. I mean, on the ones that I feel like it would benefit you to show your work is where I always like to see your work. So that's kind of one of the reasons I do some questions as fill in the blank versus show your work, is because some of them, it's going to help your grade better if I get a chance to see your work attached to it as well. So I had one gal, she was really sad that I couldn't give her Sunday to take it, because I'm like, I need Sunday to grade them. So I mean, I definitely hope to have them graded by Sunday night or Monday morning, because I have to have grades posted by Tuesday at 9. So that's kind of why. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was mainly because of how quick of a grade turnaround they need from me. That I yeah, that's why I mean, it's the one I try to make sure I let you all know is like, this one's different because I have to get grades done. So, well, and like I said, I mean, one of the biggest things, assuming you have time, right? I mean, going through some of this review stuff, you can, of course, I mean, one thing that's great about taking an online class versus face to face is you can fast forward the stuff that you're like, okay, yeah, I don't need to hear that. Like, that's something I'm fine with. So there's, again, this one's a little bit longer of a video. It kind of mentions up here kind of the topics that are covered in it. And so you can kind of, and it's in that order. So you can always kind of fast forward through the stuff that's covered there. I mean, 46 minutes, I cover all of that stuff pretty quick for you. And then again, some kind of more targeted stuff down here that I've had students asking questions about. Of course, it does not mean that this is the only stuff that you should ask questions about, but that's kind of like the most common questions that students kind of wanted to see review topics from. Please send, emails, postings on discussion boards if other things pop up, especially if like, well, this wasn't recovered in the review video and I have a question on this there as well. All right, so like on this front part of the paper, there you're just going to be working with one variable. It's either going to be quantitative or categorical, but it's only going to be one variable in the question that you're working with. For the most part, it's kind of starting here, because this is when you're working with an individual. That was module 1. So that one's usually a little bit easier to point out because there's not a sample size that shows up in that first part. So usually this one, most students feel okay with recognizing. It's kind of besides that one. So when you're working with, anytime you see the word proportion show up, that's going to be a categorical variable. That's the only time we use proportions for categorical variables. So the sampling distribution of the proportion is for a categorical variable, as well as the stuff down here that's labeled as proportion of one sample. Now the difference is just kind of being what you're being asked to do for the question. Anytime that I want you up here, you are specifically going to see something in the question that says the term sampling distribution. So you're going to see this exact same terminology show up in the question. So for example, if I actually go back here and looking at our review, the never ending review, like for example, here you see this sampling distribution show up in the question. So you're going to see that terminology in the problem when you're going to want to use it. It just comes down to, is it a categorical variable or is it a quantitative variable? And so if I were to go back and look at, like for this one, we're looking at students that graduate within 4 years. So if I were to ask you, do you graduate within 4 years? What's your answer? Yes or no. So it's categorical. So for that reason, I would know on that one, I'm going to be doing a sampling distribution of the proportion. Yeah, so all this kind of stuff. First, if I asked you to do a specific confidence interval instead, you would be here. Hypothesis test, you would be here. Sample size, you would be here. But these are all for that one categorical variable. Then down here is one quantitative variable, as well as the sampling distribution of the mean is for one quantitative variable. But then kind of same idea of distinguishing. Does it say sampling distribution in the problem? Is it asking to do a confidence interval, hypothesis test, or sample size? Mm-hmm. Variable type. So proportion is if it's a categorical variable, mean if it was quantitative. So if instead, like it was looking at the length of time it took someone to graduate, like length of time would be quantitative instead, and so then we'd be working with the mean instead. Does that help with the front side, Tanya? Okay, flip into the back side. So I actually start at the bottom of it because they're labeled exactly how you would remember them. So this one has two categorical variables in it on the side there. This one has two quantitative variables in it. So those are specifically labeled just like how you would know when you're working with them. So if you have two categorical variables, it's going to be the chi-square test. If you have two quantitative variables, it's going to be that regression for those. Then up at the top for all of these, all three of these, this is one categorical variable and one quantitative variable. So that's where you have one of each. How you decipher is that categorical variable, you're going to say, well, how many category options are there? So for example, if I was just comparing men and women, I would just have the two groups. So I would either have two independent or two dependent. If instead I was maybe comparing Republicans, Democrats, and independents to each other, then I would have three samples that I'm comparing, so I would have to be doing that Anova. And when it comes to choosing, though, between the two dependent and the two independent, that's where drawing those pictures and figuring out how that sampling is being done has to be given. So for example, if I'm looking at how do you guys do on the final compared to how you did on exam one, if I take your exam one score and your final exam score, it's the same student, so it would be paired. But if instead I wanted to compare, well, how did you guys do on the final compared to how my students in the spring did on the final, I wouldn't have any way of pairing students between the two courses, so they would be independent samples instead. Yeah, so they kind of like they match someone to that person. Yep. Yep. Well, that's why it's always remember, keep in mind that they're independent until you know otherwise. Like, right, so basically that lack of information is kind of like, okay, they're independent because I don't have any reason to pair them. Yep. Okay. So that's going to be a working backwards question. So first of all, I'll go ahead and point out that there's this nice little video that you kind of can watch there as well. It's going to be based on how that question is phrased. Anytime you see the word percentile, that's always how much is to the left. So that's the number you would go to the table with. So if it asked for the 20th percentile, I would look for 0.20. If it asked for the 90th percentile, look for 0.90. Percentile is always how much is to the left of it. other ways that the question could be phrased. It could say, I'm trying to find, the bottom 70% or the top 20%. That word, that bottom, would tell me then to shade left versus that top would tell me that I'm shading right. And so if I had like the top 30%, that would mean that 30% would be to the right of the number. But since my table reads left, that's why I would look at that 70% instead. So it's kind of like really going back to like that table always reads left. So that's when I had to worry about looking at like that opposite thing in the table. It's if my picture was actually shaded right. Cutoff can be used for any of it. It's always gonna, whenever you see that cutoff, it's gonna mean you're doing a working backwards problem. But it's always then, okay, are we trying to find the cutoff for the top 10% or the bottom 10%? So you still kind of look at what kind of values attach that percentage that you're working with. Keep in mind again that percentile is always going to tell you that percent to the left of the value. Yeah, that's been a long time ago. All right, what other questions y'all got? So I didn't have any emailed to me this time. I thought with the final I would have tons, but nothing. So, like, look at that. You're just going in order. I'm just teasing. I wouldn't say, box plots wasn't a huge thing that we did. This video is because maybe some people got confused by like the Q1 and Q3. I still think it's nice to be able to understand what a box plot is, but it's not one that we did a ton of interpreting. So you should be able to look at a box plot, but I'm not usually going to say be able to, you have to interpret it. So when I did those variances of between stuff, it was really trying to help you guys understand what analysis of variance was doing. It's nothing I would test you over directly. But I think sometimes just like me, just me just giving you a formula I don't ever like to do. So like I like to give some explanation behind the formula, even though I'm not going to test you directly over that. Yeah, but mainly just trying to kind of understand what's going on a little bit. Yeah, independent, dependent was something some students struggle with, so there's some more pictures to go with it there. Some people have had a hard time determining the sign for the dependent hypothesis, like the less than or greater than based upon the order of subtraction. That was sometimes. Well, these review videos mainly came from the first few times I taught the course. I asked students what big questions they had so I could put together some videos. These are the big questions that always seem to come up, that they seem to kind of struggle the most with. But like I said, that doesn't mean that there isn't something else that comes up that you're like, yeah, I don't remember this. So, biggest reason why people will miss points again on I hate saying this, it's not doing all the parts. Like, right, so still make sure you have those steps down. Hopefully, at this point they're almost becoming second nature because you've done them so many times, but like, don't forget to do that silly decision rule. Reject HO if p-value is less than alpha. Like, I assign points to that part. Don't forget that part. Like, right, don't forget to show your conditions. So it's like just kind of forgetting to do things that students will miss big points for. Just kind of forgetting to do stuff. Leaving some stuff blank. And sometimes I don't know if that's because they just didn't know or they didn't realize they didn't fill in a blank. So, that's where kind of double checking and making sure you have all those fill in the blanks filled in as you're going through things there as well. a confidence interval only has 4. But I mean, and like when it comes down to like the 5 steps versus the 4 steps, those are more of ways like, like, right, I'm trying to present it to you guys to understand it. As I've said before, don't worry about actually like labeling them, like, right, that way if I'm not going to care how you numbered them, right? So it's just like more of like a checklist of making sure you've done everything. You don't have to number them. They don't have to be in that specific order. Like some students seem to put their conditions first every single time, that way they don't forget to do them and then kind of continue on with the problem. Again, it's just more of like, these are the things I'm going to be looking for as I'm grading it. So to kind of make sure that you're not missing anything on like off of that checklist, but how you number it, not important for me at all. And you've all been at review sessions before too, right? So remember, if you get stuck, you can't get a number to make sense, invent a number so you can finish the rest of the problem, that you can show me that you knew how to do the rest of it. At least the good news, a lot with like the stat crunch problems, enough of the numbers are there that usually you're less likely to get stuck in a problem with that. But in the older stuff, we tended to see to get stuck with I got a z-score of 72, I know it's wrong. Like it just, right? So like, okay, pretend z was 2 so that I can just kind of keep going from there as well. But I mean, also don't forget, right, iMath, everything's in review mode right now except for Module 7, and Module 7 will be, as of Friday at 12:01 a.m. will be in review mode. So you can always go back there. Every time you go out there, it's going to have different problems for you. Remember, it does not affect your grades at all. I also like to remind you, if you do iMath, that I can no longer see the problems you're working on. So if you have questions on them, you have to make sure you're kind of telling me the problem you're looking at, because I can't see what you're looking at in review mode. That's kind of another way to just kind of getting some more targeted practice. It's like, okay, Module 2B, that was my worst one. I want to go back and practice some more. So you can kind of go back and just kind of do some review mode out there on iMath as well. Yes, I can't remember if I've already done it or not. Let me check. Right, so let me see up here. All right, so the one pre-quiz is dropped. Only one homework quiz is currently dropped, so I'll be dropping a second one of those. And I already have the regular quiz dropped. So the only thing that's going to change right now out there is a second homework quiz will be dropped. Because right now, one is being dropped. Pardon? I think I actually had most of those at the very beginning of the semester or pretty early on, because that way people weren't panicking about like if they had a 0. I didn't want it influencing their grade too badly. But what you should see, and I don't know if I don't want you all to see everyone else's grades. Let me see if I can go to student view here real quick. You'll see them all, but they're going to be, so I don't know if I can actually do that here because I don't think I have any scores. But when you're looking at your actual grades, a lot of times it's going to have a little thing kind of like next to it that kind of will show you that it's not actually being calculated in your grade. When I'm looking at it, it's kind of like a pinkish color when I look at it to kind of know which one you're being dropped. But you should be like kind of like hover over your lowest quiz score and kind of see that it's being dropped. So you'll still see them all. It's just not going to actually be factoring into your overall grade. So let me see. I don't even know what student view always looks like here. Yeah, so when you go down, I can actually look at these averages. Like I will drop the next homework quiz after everything is due tomorrow. Like that's where I'm kind of hovering for that, wait for that module 7 to be there. It's not going to have a huge effect on anyone's grade unless they probably have a 0 that's being dropped. But otherwise it's just going to have like a slight adjustment in your grade for that. But what you should see then, like when you look at like your average down here, for example, it should be dropping your lowest quiz score. Even though you might see all of your quiz scores there, it should be dropping it for you. But always let me know if it feels like that doesn't seem to be working. I can always double check it too. Because I always have to trust that this. All right, what other questions you guys got? And I know, like, probably been just finishing the module 7, so you haven't had tons of time to actually look at stuff yet. But like, right, looking at old exams can be very helpful. Looking at that final exam practice, doing, you don't have to do all that review that's out there, but it's just kind of nice to have some extra videos to watch if there was a specific topic that you're feeling uncomfortable with, or it's been a while since you've seen before. But I mean, just please don't hesitate to continue to reach out with questions. Like, again, whether that's email, discussion boards. Well, that's why I tell people, I'm like, we do our best, but just like talk to the camera, let me know. And I was like, oh, no big deal. Because I mean, even though I told my kids I'm doing a Zoom, I have a daughter up here in the corner anyway, waiting for me to be off so she can have a snack. So, Correct. Yep. Yep. Expected counts. Yeah, if I want you to do it, you'll be given it. And I believe like that might even be on this practice. Let me look if it was or not. I can't remember. I know on one of the practices I gave the formula. So that's not one that you'd be expected to memorize. Yeah. Here. Yeah, I would give you that little formula if you needed it. What other questions you got? So I'm gonna say, okay, so first being honest, it truly has mattered the student. So I would say it's probably been pretty close to 50-50 of who do better and who does worse. Mainly because there's some students, if I'm blunt, that have such high exam scores, it'd be hard for them to do better on the final than they do on the test. And so, I mean, just with it being cumulative, theirs will usually be a little bit lower. I have some students who aren't doing well and don't ever come to reviews, or like haven't reached out with any questions. They have a tendency to bomb the final just because they weren't doing well early, but they never asked for help. And so I kind of have like, those are like the two extreme cases. The ones in the middle, usually what I find is that most students, your final exam is lower than exam 1, but higher than exam 2. So it's usually between those two scores, because usually exam 1 is usually our best test because there wasn't over a ton of material yet. It was not too bad. Test 2, we have a tendency to take a dip because it's that first hypothesis testing and confidence interval. So usually the final is between those two for students who truly tried the entire semester. I'll phrase it that way. Because I do have some people that just kind of stop doing stuff, and I don't know why. They still take the final, so you know. The average on the final, I would say, is usually somewhere between like a 70 and a 78. Kind of just depending upon if the bombers take the final or not. It's a tendency to affect that average. Some there as well. So that's kind of usually why it will end up being lower, is because of someone who gets like a 20 or something on the final. just because that kind of stuff still seems to happen, which the median's usually more like that 75-ish range is usually a little bit more when that's at. So I mean, hopefully you guys have seen like from the previous test, it's never my goal to trick you. I mean, I hope that, you know, all the other tests you've looked at, there wasn't anything that really you're like, oh, I wasn't expecting something like that. So that's never my goal, and I'm not going to suddenly do that to you on the final. I probably would say the one newer thing that we struggle with, because it hasn't been on anything besides the final, is that first part of just choosing those appropriate tests. Just because it's now covering everything, that one sometimes we struggle with a little bit more, is just choosing those. But again, pardon? I don't think so, but let me double check. No. These are all kind of like problems I actually had to work through. But in a sense, they're kind of hidden, because by you having to figure out what formula to use, you're kind of doing those questions at the same time. And so that's why I kind of said, like, you know, if you go through and just kind of like read the problems and try to figure out what formula you're using, you're basically practicing that for yourself there as well. Yeah. 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 All right. Anything else for our last couple minutes here? Some questions can be kind of like redos, like kind of like maybe students didn't do well the first time, but I do have new questions on them too. But it's not like what affects those things is different. That like, not changing anything like that on you. So even though you might not have been tested specifically over it, it's shown up before. All right. So remember, when is the final exam due? Saturday. Okay. Just that's going to be our big thing. Like I will remind you all that when I send out about Module 7 being graded. Like I will remind everyone again then. So that's why I'm doing the review sessions a day earlier than I did last time. So yep. Yeah, so it opens Friday morning, closes Saturday night. So it's still the 48-hour window to do it. All right. Well, you guys know how to reach out to me if you have other questions. Okay. Oh, no problem. That's what I'm here for. Thank you all. Bye.
What does accessible mean?